Hello and welcome to the Azure Cloud Chronicles. I'm Joey D'Antoni, and you're back. We're back, and today we're going to be talking about Managed Instance Part 2. John, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi all, my name is John Morehouse. I am a principal consultant with D'Antoni and Associates, and I love all things Azure.
And I'm a Principal Cloud Architect at 3Cloud, and today we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons of Managed Instances. We talked about a lot of these things, and we're going to just kind of explore them in more detail in our last episode. Mainly, we want to talk about disaster recovery with some detail around how it's different than Azure SQL Database. It's pretty similar, but there are a couple of things that are kind of different. We're going to talk about some of the challenges with MI that we faced. We've had a lot of customers on this platform, and we've seen a lot of stuff. Probably the biggest thing is storage performance. There's some blog posts that have been floating around the internet, particularly loud blog posts, and I kind of want to talk with John about some of those and help you understand what the challenges, especially if you're on general purpose, are. We're going to talk about the cost, because it can be kind of expensive, especially if you have growing data volume. We'll also talk about downtime and the process for updates. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the benefits and kind of compare and contrast with VMs. There are places where you might want to use VMs, and there are places where managed instance makes a lot of sense. And I really wanted to cover all of those things. So let's get started. All right,
We are
DR. When
always,
when MI started, I remember there was a limitation that there's this concept in Azure we may have talked about before called paired regions. Like US West is paired with US East, US West 2 is paired with US West 2 is paired with North Central, West Europe is paired with North Europe. But each of those paired regions has like more network bandwidth between them and dedicated network bandwidth. In the early days of MI, you could only have your DR replica in a paired region, but I think that's a little bit different now. John, do you want to talk about failover groups and kind of how all that works?
sure. And if you're familiar with failover groups and Azure SQL Database, it's the same kind of concept. So we can have a pure replica of the entire instance for managed instance, and I just as you said, either in a paired region, or now we can put it in, I think, any region.
Yeah, I think so.
Uh,
Any like commercial cloud region. So that
yeah,
means you can't go from like Gov Cloud to US West 2, but yeah.
Yeah, and the trick with that is that you can't actually do a failover group within the same region. So
Hmm.
Microsoft actually forces you to have a replica of the MI in a different region. So in case that the primary region fails, you can come online on in your secondary, wherever you put it. Right. And so basically it's a distributed availability groups underneath the scenes. And so as you add new databases to the instance, it automatically gets replicated to your secondary. The downfall is that it's the whole thing. Like you
Hmm.
can't pick and choose specific databases to replicate or anything like that. It's the whole instance in its entirety. The networking is a little bit more complex, right? You've got DNS zones and other things to deal with managed instance. Changing the failover group can be a little bit complicated depending on what your deployment looks like. But it's a good solid. I've always thought it was a good solid DR strategy if you're running managed instance in Azure.
Yeah, architecturally, it's the same as what's in SQL DB. The
Hmm.
differences are kind of to John's point, because managed instance is on a private networking environment. You're a little bit more responsible for configuring the DNS zones on both sides and putting the listener in that DNS zone, or it's not the listener, but whatever they call the failover group name. I can't remember that off the top of my head. Uh, but it effectively acts as the single point of connection. John, can you read off a secondary like that?
You can.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I believe there's a read write
Endpoint. That's right. There's a read
endpoint.
write endpoint,
Yep.
and
There's
there's
a read
a
write endpoint. So if you do the read intent with your application connection string, it'll get directed to that secondary. Now, if you're running business critical, you actually get a secondary read replica in your primary region, right? So that's a bonus right there.
yeah. If you remember from our first session, or even I think what we talked about with Bob, general purpose effectively acts like a failover cluster instance in that it uses storage for high availability. Business critical is going to act as a availability group where you're going to have multiple 3 to 4 replicas in one region. And then the other thing that's a little bit challenging, I think, about MI here, and this is going to tie into the next topic we're going to talk about, is because of that, you have to protect all the instances in your MI for the failover group is your storage cost, and therefore your compute cost can get pretty high if you're doing things that way.
Because unfortunately, in some cases, the compute is tied to the storage performance, which
Or
kind of leads,
volume, or volume.
or volume,
Yeah,
or volume, or
volume's the
volume.
problem. The performance I can deal with a little bit, but yeah,
What's the GP is what? MI 16 terabytes?
yeah. GP and business critical are both 16
16
terabytes, but if I
terabytes.
remember correctly, they both have kind of a hockey stick in the number of cores you have to purchase to go beyond 8.
I believe that's correct. Now,
Yeah,
next gen I think they bumped it up to 32 terabytes.
which is still
Um,
in preview.
yeah, which is still in preview.
I have a meeting about that next week.
Oh, good,
Yeah,
good.
not
Maybe
unfortunately, it's
it'll
not with
like magically
Microsoft.
come out. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that does kind of lead us into our next topic that I wanted to address because, like I said, we've seen some of the blog posts and read some of the stuff online, and it's not wrong. It's just maybe been handled a little bit aggressively. There's something that I think we've known since the very beginning of Managed Instance, and it's not very well documented, and that's probably part of the problem here. And I'm going to explain it. It's basically the performance of storage in general purpose, specifically general purpose V1. General purpose V1 uses paid storage for each database, which is similar to the architecture of Azure SQL Database general purpose. The difference is with Azure SQL Database, that performance is allocated to one database. It's not a scenario where you have multiple user databases all going after the same IO pool. So what can happen, and this kind of sucks, if you have small databases, you don't get a lot of IO because you get a single page file in or a page blob or whatever we're calling those things in storage, and it's if it's 100 gig or even like 10 gig. I think you get, a couple of hundred IOPS or 500 IOPS. It's not a lot of IO. So you really want to, before you migrate into MI or right after you migrate, you want to increase the size of those data files. It's always kind of been documented. There's a SQL Cat blog post from right after when Managed Instance came out that talked about this. But there's kind of two problems there. One, it's not in docs, I don't think, or if it is, it's not really super well covered. And then secondly, just people don't know that like I have to resize to get the IO performance I need because like Amazon RDS, for all its faults, doesn't work that way either. Um, so it's something that's very unique to Managed Instance. Also, as we mentioned earlier, the pricing of MI is heavily tied to the storage volume. So if you're blowing out the size of your databases to a terabyte, so you get decent IO, that means you can fit a lot less databases on the MI. Thoughts?
Uh, I wish next gen would come out because you can fit more databases on now with next
Yeah.
gen, but it's still preview. Um, and the storage is different,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Next gen's going to work a lot more like
But
normal
differently.
storage. Just go ahead and explain that. I think people want to hear that.
Yeah, and I don't. They changed so they changed the underlying storage for next gen MI to be more flexible and to help get around the problem that you just described, where
Hmm.
you get throttled by the I/O because of the size of the database. Which who really wants to do a migration and have to size your database up to a terabyte to get
Hmm.
better performance? That doesn't sound fun at all.
Yeah.
But with next gen, they did change it. I don't know exactly what they landed on. I don't know if it's been publicly announced yet or not. So, but it
But the general concept is more like putting all of your databases on a single disk that's got a shared IO pool, right?
that
Yeah.
general concept is like
Yeah.
premium SSD V2, right?
Yeah.
So we know with I don't have we talked about that disk type yet?
Yeah, I think we
Have
did.
we?
Yeah, we did a storage session.
Well, so with that storage, just to recap, with premium SSD V2, you can more granularly control like your IOPS, your bandwidth, as well as your capacity. So there's a slider window or a slider option in the Azure portal, which makes it really flexible. So
More importantly, to John's point, they can all be changed independently. All three
yeah,
of those
yeah,
dimensions can be changed independently.
and that's a great point, which makes it super flexible. And so the concept is that next gen is going to be on that type of storage, where we will have as consumers will have better control over our IOPS and throughput. So maybe I need an 8 core MI, but I have a IOP intensive workload. I can adjust the MI configuration to match for that. The downside with that is if I need all the IOPS, as Joey mentioned earlier, it's tied to the number of cores.
Hmm.
So unfortunately, we have to elevate the number of cores depending on the scenario to get those higher level of IOPS. Even in next gen, I know that you and I both have talked to Microsoft about that. Like, this is, can we decouple that or whatever? I don't know if they'll ever do that, but unfortunately, that's the way it is.
Yeah, Postgres has actually done that. So like the Azure Postgres service is closer to the way RDS works. And RDS, I will say it's got some faults, and we'll talk about TempDB here in a minute, but uh, you do kind of independently get to choose your disk. There are tighter limits, and I think there's still a 16 terabyte limit, but you get to choose the profile and type of disk you want. Likewise, if you're using the Azure Postgres service, that's effectively, you're just choosing they give you a limited set of VM types that you can choose that are kind of good for database workloads. And then you can choose a managed disk v2, and you can, just like if it was on your VM. One of the other things that kind of frustrates me a little bit about all of these services is that you can only have one disk. Uh, I I understand why the cloud providers want to do that, because it starts to get messy when you have people having custom disk configs in their managed database services. But it would be really nice if you could, spread stuff across a couple of volumes, but you can't. So it's a single disk. And one of the other things to note is on general purpose, TempDB is on the flash drive on the volume, kind of like you would typically configure on the VM. In business critical, TempDB is on the drive with your databases. So because your databases are in that temporary drive. So you're kind of contending with TempDB for at least space. The IO is pretty unlimited on those blades because
Yeah.
you're going local. But that's also something to keep in mind. And that's kind of our next topic. And this was something we had when we were working together, we had a client that had pretty substantial problems that were like, I think ultimately traced back to TempDB. Do you remember the detail on that? I mean, I think
Don't,
it
but
was tied to like failovers that were getting triggered by probably least timeouts from TempDB contention.
I seem to recall a lot of like unplanned failovers, and
Hmm.
I think that you were correct that they were related to TempDB contention and unresponsive AG checks, right? And so the
Hmm.
MI would fail over in the middle of the day, which is not a good, not is that's not good, right?
Yeah.
Because your production workload's got to fail over. Um, but I also know that that client was pushing the boundaries of general purpose pretty,
Yeah.
like they had the limit with 100 databases, they had 99. You
Hmm.
know, they were pushing the physical constraints of the MIs pretty hard, and their workloads were pretty hard. And they even had some business critical ones. They had some
Yeah.
business critical MIs that also had TempDB problems, even with that locally attached. You know, it's right
Hmm.
there locally to the MI. They still had issues with TempDB in some circumstances.
Yeah, and the TempDB contention is largely an IO problem. Like it's so managed instance right now is running, unless it got upgraded in the last week, but I think they would have told us, is running on SQL Server 2022. The one thing it does not have is the in-memory OLTP TempDB. I forget what that feature is
Metadata.
called, but I think page allocation or object creation uh, that does not exist. So that's some performance that you could get that's not available. Um, but kind of the point is, and I think we've said this in both episodes, if you have workloads that are really critical to your business and moreover are very busy, you probably don't want to move to a PaaS database service unless you really designed your architecture around the use of that PaaS database service. If you have database servers that you kind of don't have to monitor every day, it's really a good fit. It's the ones that are like super busy, super resource intensive. You're not going to have a good time on a managed service because they really are kind of designed for, I don't want to say they're not suitable for high end workloads because business critical is, but if you have like 30 or 40 databases that are super busy, it's just not going to be a great experience. And you have the part of the problem is you have limited levers you can pull. It's not like a VM where like there's a VM in Azure that has 17 terabytes of memory. Uh,
That's
that kind of thing doesn't exist in a managed database solution.
See, and that's why I really wish that next gen would come out, because I agree with you that if you're on general purpose right now, super critical workload, unless you fine tune that deployment, your experience might be not good. Next gen, though, I think will help improve that.
Yeah.
If you're pushing the boundaries of next gen, you probably should just move to business critical.
Yeah, but I mean, I think even on business critical, like, and we've seen this with like one of Monica's clients that was on RDS. There are just some like inherent limitations because
Sure. Yeah,
you can't turn TempDB knobs the way you could on a V. Like,
that's true. That's
yeah,
true.
yeah, it's you want to be comfortable that you're well within like I'd say like the 80th percentile on the service. You're fine because that gives you a good bit of overhead. And like 80% is always my number. If CPU is below 80% on a very very busy database server, you're doing okay because you got some headroom. But
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. I think
yeah,
that, and I got a client that's waiting for next gen to come out,
yes, same. Like
so they
it's
can they can push that button to do that migration.
yeah. Updates. Unfortunately, this is not the cleanest process either, but it is managed for you. So uh, you don't have to do your own updates. Yay.
Yay! But Microsoft's Microsoft, I think we talked about it in the last video where an
Yeah.
update can get stuck and then you can't change the MI until that maintenance window rolls around and the
Yeah.
update actually happens.
I had one happen where I tried to upsize from GP to business critical, and this was pretty early in the history of MI. And I was doing a presentation at Bits, and I wanted to show something with Hekaton, and Hekaton's only available on business critical, or at least it was. I don't know if it's still the case.
There's certain parts are available in
Okay,
GP,
yeah,
but not like durable in memory. So you can't do
yeah.
all of it, but some parts are.
And I went to flip from GP to BC, and I had several hours, and it just didn't go, and I had to escalate. And I ran into Connor Cunningham, and I'm like, Connor, I need a favor. Like this is stuck. Can you call somebody? And he's like, yeah, no problem. And it turned out it was like hung on Windows updates.
Really?
Yeah, I was like, that's quality service you built their managed instance team.
Well, and do you remember?
They've gotten better, but it's still not per. We've still seen some pretty weird hangups in the update space.
Well, and I mean, if you and I get together, we're going to break something in Azure. So, I mean, because do you remember that the same client, we had to scale up one of their MIs to, and they had like memory optimized, right? So they had
Mhm.
that special hardware selection,
Oh, right, right.
right? They were memory optimized, and we were scaling them up in some fashion. I can't remember what aspect we were scaling them up for, cores or capacity. But in the scaling process, they got it actually downgraded them because Microsoft didn't have capacity on that
Oh,
hardware
oh yeah.
for that particular SKU, and so they downgraded them to the non-memory optimized tier. And that was wild. That was wild that it
That was your
actually,
failure pattern, yeah.
yeah, that was the failure pattern instead of just not scaling and just canceling it out and going back to the original hardware. I thought that
That
was
was
wild.
capacity was a hot topic. I did a talk at the Redgate thing in New York on Tuesday, and capacity in clouds, particularly Azure, is a hot topic right now.
I'm seeing more and more. I've had actually more and more clients ask me about capacity because they're
Yeah.
seeing, hey, we can't get capacity in this particular SKU in Azure.
It's particularly bad in Europe and any region in the US that has central in the name.
Yes.
Yeah, mainly South Central, but North Central is not much better. Uh,
And unfortunately, I have a client that's in Central.
yeah. We jokingly call South Central the Walmart region. That was the inside joke I've heard. Uh, but I also didn't know how much of that's like how much of OpenAI is Azure hosting and how much of that is consuming resources. But those are all things you have to kind of keep in mind. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about capacity in another episode because that's something that has been a hot
we
topic.
should talk about capacity for
Yeah,
sure.
so let's talk about some of the really positive things. I think backup is something that I can say
Absolutely.
is really positive because you absolutely
Absolutely.
don't have to think about it.
And I love that as a DBA. I don't, if a client puts a new database out there, obviously we can account for that on a VM, right? We use OLS code and it just picks it up, but I don't have to worry about it. I know the backups are taken care of. I don't have to do anything with it really, unless they want long-term retention or something.
And Managed
It's
Instance
easy.
really does give us the best of both worlds with backup too, because the service manages the backup for us, and we can't directly access those backup files. Like we can do a restore, but we can't like download the backups. But if you need to take a backup, you can do a copy only backup to blob storage. So if you want to like
which is
move
handy.
a database from MI to a dev server that's a VM, or even another MI, as long as you don't need to do a point in time restore and you're only restoring a full, you can do that. And that's something that's really handy, and I like that
I
flexibility.
love that. Yep.
Yeah, you can even do not that I've ever done one, but you can do a copy only log backup too. Uh, I tested that at some point just for the sake of testing it. The problem is with MI, you can't restore with no recovery. So if you're going to another MI, you could having that log backup wouldn't be handy. Plus, like you probably wouldn't have the full chain,
Yeah.
but fulls are good. John mentioned long-term storage. Um, I think the range of what you can keep normal backups is what, 7 to 35 days.
Yeah, point in time is up to 35 days. So you can configure each database individually for, by default, you get 7 days point in time. But you can extend that to 35 days. And then if you need long term, you can go up to 10 years.
And I
So,
think you can reduce, at least on database, you can reduce that to 1 day. And you might ask, why might you want to reduce that to 1 day? Uh, and I and
why would you want to do that, Joey?
you have to pay for backups based on volume, and Microsoft takes log backups based on volume. So if you have something like a data warehouse where you're like churning a bunch of data every day, so you have really big log backups, but you could easily restore your data from source systems, then you might want to not keep those log backups, which takes us to one other point about both managed instance and SQL DB. They're always running in full recovery mode.
I was just going to mention that.
That will probably always be the case. John, you want to explain why?
Well, because the service is managing the backups, and they have to have protection around the backups to guarantee it. But then also for high availability and
Yeah.
disaster recovery, you have to have the database in full recovery in order to have the transaction logs and transaction log backups. And so that has to be in full recovery. We've asked a couple times to like be able to select, at least on MI.
Yeah.
If we could have simple, I
I don't think we could ever have simple, but
I don't think we could do it either.
I kind of phrased the question. We had a meeting sort of about this the other day, and I phrased my request on this. Like, can you just like take my log backups to null? So like I don't pay for the log backups because that's really what the request is. By the way, fun fact: there's no difference in perform on IO throughput if you're in simple or full. Like it's the same.
Yep.
At some very deep internal level, the IO is tracked in a different way, but it's the same amount of IO. You're not getting any performance by not being in full. There's just costs associated with it.
I'm gonna say something, I don't remember what. Oh, backups.
Yeah.
Had an interesting thing happen this relatively recently. Had a client that their source database. It's the client that's waiting to go to next gen. They had a source database that had replication on it, and when they tried to restore the database locally, there's an error, and so the error would get thrown into Management Studio, but the database would be offline, and you could set the database online and actually fix the problem. When you try to restore that backup to MI, because the error gets thrown, the database disappears.
Oh, wow.
So you can't like go to the database on MI and bring it online and like do your due diligence to fix it. So I had to go fix it locally, figure out what was going on.
Take a new backup.
Yeah, take a new backup and then restore that, and that worked. But it was really interesting that because the error gets thrown, which kind of makes sense, right? It's a service. The database has to be online for the service to work. But it disappeared.
I know we've complained about availability, but while we're talking about positive things, the availability is really good if you're not doing ridiculous things to your MI. Like the service is pretty robust, and you're going to have good uptime, and you don't have to worry about configuring anything like availability groups or any of those things like you would on-prem to get HA.
Now, another thing, a good thing, since we're talking about good things, I love that MI, I can schedule it to shut down.
Yeah, that's something that's relatively new, and you can't even do that with serverless. Like you can't. There's no command to pause a serverless Azure.
Which I wish. I wish there was a command.
Morgan.
I wish there was a command. But that's a good thing that I like about MI is that I can schedule it, especially like dev test.
Yeah, for sure. And our demo type environments,
QA,
we like to use.
I can schedule it to and not only shut it down, but start it up at certain times. So I help save my clients money because I can just shut it down.
Cool. Well, that's a wrap because I know you have a tight out here in a minute. Thank you, like and subscribe, and join us next time. We'll probably be talking about Azure SQL Database and all its
Yay!
flavors and variations. All right, talk to you later. Bye.
See ya.